My presentation is about the Russian Orthodox churches in Armenia, which are somehow invisible in our reality. There are very few. The Russian Orthodox community is not a large one, despite the fact that according to the population census, we have about 7,500 Russians living here, but it includes Russian, Ukrainian, Greek, and other Orthodox faithful, but they do not attend, not all of them actually attend church services or consider themselves to be faithful Orthodox. But the main topic of presentation would be so-called colonialism, which I called silent coloniality in the urban landscape, looking at the cities in Armenia. I would like to invite your attention also to the fact that our research community and scientific community is not looking at this reality, and as a research topic it doesn't exist in our discourse. So, coloniality is a concept and influence of the colonial culture and mentality on the local social, political, and cultural practice, in some cases intentionally or unintentionally reproducing the colonial past, as defined by several authors. And they extend their influence even over to the post-colonial period, and they argue that for a long period they continue to have influence over cultural, social, political realities of the former colonies. And they may be even re-actualize if there are some enabling circumstances such as political process, wars, conflicts, economy and economic issues and migration. And religion is a key to colonialization process because it was one of the main instruments. It was well described in different pieces of research. And I would like to move to the Armenian realities. When in the first quarter of the 19th century, to be more precise, in 1828, when Eastern Armenia was actually taken over by the Russian Empire, colonization started. Colonialization was one of the specific tools used by Russian Tsars. So when Russia actually moved to the east to Siberia, they started to build churches as a token of the presence of the imperial powers and influence over there. And we see the same notion also in Armenia.
Վերցնեմ միայն ներկա արևելյան Հայաստանի տարածքը, որտեղ ռուս բնակչությունը որպես այդպիսին ուղղափառ բնակչությունը
where the Russian Orthodox population was small in numbers. It was increasing throughout the 19th century, but nevertheless, in several rural areas and mostly urban areas, they were concentrated. And the assumption is that they should have taken advantage of these numerous churches. There were quite a few, more than 5,000 churches around, mostly in cities. Today, we only have less than a dozen. The number of Orthodox churches, when they were being built, their landscape positioning and the names as well could imply that they were mostly symbolic gestures, not to cater to the religious needs of the increasing Russian population, but rather and mostly landmarks to symbolize the imperial power, to transform the Armenian religious landscape towards this. You see two churches here. The first is the Saint Alexandra of Rome, which is still erect in Alexandrople on the territory of the Russian military base. And the second is the Saint Nicholas, the wonder worker, Chudotvorets, used to be in Yerevan. It's been demolished in the early Soviet period, like most of other Yerevan churches. These are brilliant examples that are representative of the other churches. Most of these churches, this way or other, were linked to Russian power projection, that is, the military presence. They were usually built for Cossacks that were part of the armed forces. Most of the several dozen churches were garrison churches and they no longer exist. And the names also are quite remarkable. For example, the first church on portrait on this slide, Saint Alexandra, was called after Queen Alexandra, in honor of Saint Alexandra of Rome, the patron saint of Queen Alexandra, Empress Alexandra. And this also emphasized her belonging to the Romanov dynasty. The second was Saint Nicholas the Wonder Worker, which also alluded to the Romanov dynasty. I will reflect on this further. The Kanaker Russian church in Yerevan initially was called Nicholas the Wonder Worker, but then it was renamed the Holy Mary Veil, it was called. Why the veil? Many churches, especially in the perimeter of Yerevan, were called St. Mary's Veil, because on the day of the taking of the fortress of Yerevan, October the 1st, was the holy feast of the Veil, which is why the churches were called after St. Mary's Veil. In Gyumri, there is, back then it was called Alexandropol. We also see the Orthodox churches mostly anchored to the Russian military presence. This is the photograph of the still erect, the so-called glittering chapel, formerly called Mikhail the Archangel, which since the 90s was upgraded from chapel to church. It was built to honor the Russian soldiers fallen in the taking of Gyumri. In the cemetery was demolished during the Soviet period. Kindergarten was built instead, and the park, whereas in the chapel there was the Museum of Russian-Armenian Friendship. The main exhibits were mostly lost during the earthquake of '88. In the 2000s, when the Putin regime started to embark on its lengthy operation, the Russian attitudes towards the churches in Armenia started to change. They actively restored, rebuilt, and rehabilitated these churches, paying special attention to this. In Gyumri, that was most apparent to this day. The Russian military base is in Gyumri, which manages the processes I just referred to. So this de facto cemetery was converted into a memorial complex, which is now called exactly that, the Hill of Honor. And the church was rebuilt and is now operational. There is an interesting fact about the church which saliently illustrates the material coloniality and the Russian presence. When they started rebuilding the church, local amateur self-taught painter created the murals, which are quite an interesting style. and they've become one of the Gyumri attractions. Tourists are taken there to see the murals. But when a Russian priest was appointed there, who used to be a military chaplain in Arkhangelsk, he decided that those murals do not comply with the Russian canon and decided that they had to be whitewashed. This led to an interesting discourse in the city. For example, there were theories that you can see here the eye that is in the ceiling. They claimed this was a Masonic symbol, and the priest was just trying to rid the church of satanic symbols. But the employees of the parish and those who were in on the fact simply claimed that they lamented the loss of the amateur murals and claimed that they had no other choice than to comply with Father Artemis' insistence, and the drive behind this change was to make it look more Russian and canonic. In Gyumri, there is one more Orthodox church. The main one is the Alexandra Church, where I simply failed to collect enough material because it's behind the gates of the military base, and very few have access. Maybe just the personnel of the military base can access it. But there is another church, Orthodox church in Gyumri, which operates in one of the suburbs of Gyumri, the so-called 8 Garadok. It's a building of a kindergarten. It's considered to be a home church, Damavaya Tserkev. Initially, it had to be called after Nikolai the Wonder Worker, but then it was renamed Muscovite Matron. Not everyone is aware of its existence, and the Russian priest of this church, this is his second main posting. He started in Alexandra Church and then was moved here. So we took part in the evening recitals in it, and it's very eloquent. The Russian military and political expansion is quite obvious the whole way, and I remind you, it's in the building of a working kindergarten. All the kids walk through the hallway. Of course, most of the inhabitants of this Garadok are the families of the servicemen of the military base, but nevertheless, there are quite a few locals as well. So these are the photographs lining up the hallways of it's Putin, Serge Sargsyan, some people in uniform. There is also military material displayed there. And the name is quite characteristic of this church. Until most recently, in the course of our fieldwork, we understood that this image of the matron is becoming increasingly more ubiquitous in Armenia, even in various vernacular sanctuaries. You can see the icon of matron. The Moscow matron replacing Nicholas, the wonder worker, is quite characteristic. When I discussed with my colleague from Petersburg, Jana, who was studying matron's cult, she said the keyword here is Moscow, not the matron, since this is reaffirming the supremacy of Moscow. And the same is visible in Yerevan. In the Kanakir church, there is a special corner set aside for the Moscow matron. This is the evening mass. The inside of the church is almost empty. It was only the priest's family and no one else. This is indicative of the fact that these churches are not in high demand. This is the contemporary interior of Alexandra's church. This is an interesting photograph, a gift from the former mayor of Gyumri to the Nicholas the Wonder Workers Church before it was transformed as a gift. It still stays there. And another image from Gyumri. They also have the half-completed church, which is called Saint Arseny. It's located in the so-called Kazachi post. This was not operational until most recently. Most of the Gyumri people perhaps were not even aware that it was consecrated by the Russian church, and they uh, get it ready to reopen. And like the Stele here says, they will build a monument to the fallen Cossacks. It will soon be converted to yet another edifice affirming Russian coloniality. A few words about Vanadzor. Vanadzor here is somewhat falling out of the pattern because first and foremost, today Vanadzor mostly is outside of the Gyumri Yerevan axis, and the church there for a long time was without a priest. They had quite a few challenges in rebuilding it, but it was eventually rebuilt. The priest there, and it's interesting, is from Ukraine. He is a local Armenian who has a dark past, semi-criminal past, as opposed to the Gyumri and Yerevan priests who have been educated in Russia or are ethnic Russians. This person simply spent several years in Ukrainian monasteries and came there from, and it's obvious his marginality. He almost has no contacts with the Russian priests, and I detected that they have some tense relations. And although this church is in downtown Vanadzor, in a park, in a place close to entertainment centers, but it doesn't have a separate environment of its own. It's obviously marginalized, perhaps also because of this Ukrainian connection. This is the Vanadzor Church. I will now move on to Yerevan. This is the Saint Virgin Veil Pokrov Church in Kanaker district of Yerevan, which was rebuilt already in the post-Soviet period. And as you see, a small annex was built, which is now used as a nunnery. There are several nuns residing there. Nuns is the proper word for it, yes. And what's interesting here is that the Russian military base in Kanaker is no longer quartered there. They moved, although there is a monument to Cossacks, but they're quite at a distance from the church and they're not in the same visual space as the church. Nevertheless, when for Russian TV they filmed a video, I will not screen it to save your time. The anchor started with the Cossacks monument and then moved on to the Russian church, creating the impression that they're in the same setting and complex. At least for the Russian viewers, in the mindset of this Russian journalist, they presented a uniform space. This is the interior during the Sunday Mass and the facade. These are some artifacts from the church, but for lack of time, I will skip reference. The church keeps continually swapping relics with other Russian churches. These are gifts and icons. iconostas is divided into two parts. The right wing is the Orthodox saints, and the left wing is the Armenian saints, but they were allowed by the Russian Church. So there are Armenian saints that are deemed to be eligible by the Russian Church. These are mostly Armenian saints. Thaddeus and Bartholomew, the apostles, Saint Shushanik, Saint Nino, which also has a Georgian inscription here, and a few words about another church newly built, which is the first ever built in the new Armenian reality. It was consecrated in 17. It is called the Saint Cross in Armenian. In Russian, it's called Kresto Vozdvizhenskoye. Patriarch Alexei took part in consecration with the attendance of high-ranking politicians and clergy, both from Armenia and Russia. It's built on a very interesting site. The popular explanation is on the highway to Echmiadzin or the airport, but it's actually next to the American embassy. So the Russian power projects itself next to the American embassy, and it's very inconveniently located. Almost no parish attends the service there. The access to it is very inconvenient. Let's not abuse your patience further. A few more seconds and I'll move on to the conclusions. Most recently, in October 21, a decision was taken to build another church in downtown Yerevan. Discussions are underway to the best of my knowledge, and negotiations about the selection of the church at the location of the Church of Nicholas the Wonder Worker, which was demolished. It's the next step in the post-colonial coloniality, projecting the soft power of Russia, which the Yerevan parish will be established, which never existed before, even in Tsarist time, but today it's already been founded. There's no time to dwell at greater length on that. And one has to acknowledge here that the Russian churches are not only playing a religious function, their presence in the Armenian urban political landscape, first and foremost, is perceived as remnants of the colonial past and history, sites lieu de mémoire, that is, and de facto, secondly, they're used by the coloniality, silent coloniality incarnations in the new neo-colonial reality to attempt to recreate and reestablish the neo-colonialism. Thank you for your attention.